Okay, sorry for the late arrival. Thank you so much for having me. So I'll just go ahead and keep moving right along with the program. So next we'd like to welcome up Johnny Achi from the Arab Americans for Syria.
Thank you all for coming and for supporting the Syrian cause. I'm glad that we have a full house. We were expecting actually more people. And today, I didn't mention it on radio, on KPFK, feeling that we will be much bigger crowd than we could accommodate. I want to thank John Parker for hosting us here on the very last minute. We tried to get a bigger venue. Fortunately, holidays and corporate parties everywhere is booked. But I also want to thank John Parker and the International Action Center for being there from day one, literally from day one. Very first few months of the crisis, we were very lone voices. The people who stood for Syria were considered, we were named every name in the book. And not a single organization wanted to stand. And we're talking about all kind of progressive and liberal organizations, not one decided or thought they would be standing on the right side of the crisis. Except for International Action Center, they saw right through what was being shown to you all coming from Syria. So they were with us from day one. They had the courage and the vision to be with us from day one, and I've said it before and I continue to say it. They were on one of the early trips to Syria with me, with Ramsey Clark and Sarah Flanders and Cynthia McKinney back early in 2013. We stood against what was popular then. Today, luckily, the pictures have, been showing the other side a bit. It is not so unpopular to say, I stand with Syria, I stand with the people, the Syrian people, for really what they really want to accomplish. Of course, Eva Bartlette, what an amazing, courageous woman. I have met her in Syria this past June, and I'm going to tell you, this last trip to Syria, we were trying on a fact-finding mission. I've done a few trips in the last 4 years. And while I was in Syria, I went to meet with the other side, wanted to go across, to the other side and see what they're thinking. And it was a group of fighters that were fighting on the other side that were in an area that was not recommended for me to go there. And I kept debating, should I go, should I not go? Everyone is recommending not to go. And that's inside Damascus. I'm not going out of Damascus. Finally, I decided to go, and we've met with some ex-fighters with Nusra and different people. And I was thinking, when I met with Eva a day later, and she was telling me she's going to go to Aleppo, I said, Aleppo? What the heck is going to take you to Aleppo? I mean, just to travel to Aleppo by itself is considered deadly. So to be actually living in Aleppo for the last 2-3 months, going back and forth more than once, I have no word to express. I know myself, I wouldn't do it myself. So I'm not ashamed of saying it. So we're going to hear a lot from Eva later on and what she has accomplished in her trip. But it brings me to the 15 minutes that I was asked to speak here. What would I speak about in the last 5 years? There's so much to talk about. But journalism, media, is what arrived, what made Syria, or the destruction of Syria, what got us here is actually the media, nothing else. If you believe me when I say, from early on in the crisis, we realized what we were up against. We would be, even on social media, we didn't think it was such a plan to destroy this little, beautiful, peaceful country of Syria. We would go on Twitter, on Facebook, trying to just raise an opinion. Next thing you know, hundreds of people were attacking us with big comments, large phrases. And we realized something is organized. This is not just happening. There's just no way that we can fight this. I'm not talking about traditional media, just social media. We realized we had to do something. So we got together, a few of us, and we started Arab Americans for Syria for the one purpose. The one purpose is try to present the other side of the story. We never were hoping that anybody should believe us. We were called all kinds of names early on. Those are the names that Ava started being called now lately. After her video went viral, of course, the press conference that she had 3 million views in less than maybe a week, which is really, really we started Americans for Syria with this small hope of getting our voices out there. Whatever we were able to do on KPFK, here and there, we encouraged some people to start coming out. As more people started listening to us, more organizations started coming out with us on the rallies, on the protests, on the events that we've had. Today we call it Eyewitness 3 because we've had a couple of eyewitnesses before with Ramsey Clark and the group that we went to Syria, and then another one with Mother Agnes. Reports from the ground. We brought people from Syria who witnessed. I can tell you, if I would not have visited Syria in those 4 or 5 years, I would probably give up or believe what most of you were believing. A lot of my Syrian friends who grew up with me and knew the situation, they started doubting. Because that's all we hear, that's all we see. We see a brutal dictator, a brutal army killing its people. Whereas the truth is the absolute and complete opposite. And if I didn't go to Syria 7 times in the last 4 years, I would have been just a victim of this vicious, brutal media war on Syria like everybody else was. So we have a duty. When I know the truth is the opposite, I cannot stand still. When I know the Syrian soldiers are dying defending the cities and defending the people, I have an obligation. Just like they're defending my cities, I've got to defend their honor. When I know my president could have left, ran away like others did, when I know he has responsibilities and duties to protect the cities, because if he leaves, there will be nothing but chaos and real civil war, if you want to put it that way. There will be a genocide, like the ex-US ambassador to Yugoslavia called it in one of the Holocaust meetings when they asked him, what do you think the next genocide would be? He goes, it would be in Syria, God forbid, if these people took over. So, our mission is just to spread the truth. We have no more hope or mission in this world, for me, personally, just to spread the truth, make it broad-based, make a positive difference. Maybe we can end this war. The media is beyond, it's a multifaceted war on Syria, but nothing was more dramatic than the media. When we were watching Al Jazeera, for some of you who watches Al Jazeera, when I used to watch it, Al Jazeera played an amazing role in the last 10 years when we were all speaking, thinking it's reporting the truth. It got to our homes. Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya, the two representatives of Qatar and Saudi Arabia, got to our every single Middle Eastern, every single Arab home by presenting the Palestinian cause, and we all believed it. They went into, but they were calling the state of Israel, they were calling, we always called the state, the occupied land of Palestine. But the first time we hear the state of Israel, they would bring people from the lieutenant and colonel from the Israeli army to talk about the situation in Gaza. Somehow they sneak into our homes. But the Syrian crisis exposed them to us at least. When we know that they know the truth and they're presenting the absolute opposite. I would wake up the first few months at home and I would hear on Al Jazeera, people are walking, moving toward Umayyad Square. They're taking it by the thousands. Umayyad Square in the middle of Damascus is like Tahrir Square in Egypt, okay? They were hoping to recreate what happened in Libya and in Egypt. I would get up and watch this, of course, the Syrian TV. Probably we're 50 years behind. I mean, don't blame us, you know. We don't have satellite. We were not prepared for this. Yes, we admit. I would call the Syrian TV, they're closed, they're open to noon. I said, can someone just go to Umayyad Square? On Al Jazeera, they're saying a call for jihad. We call upon you, all Syrian people in Damascus, to join your brothers, to walk into the streets, go into the Umayyad Square. And I would call, and I would beg, and they would open the TV early, they would put the cameras in Umayyad Square and Abbasian Square. There's nobody there, not a single one. And that's what they used in Iraq. That's what they did in Libya. Whoever believed that Iraq fallen completely the way we would picture or imagine, it didn't happen that way. It was one road from the airport to the square where the bombarded, allowed the Americans to come in. They brought down Saddam's plane, right? Saddam's status, right? And next thing you know, 500,000 Iraqi soldiers surrendered because they told them it's over. We won the war. That thing we're trying to do exactly the same thing in Syria. Every event that took place in Syria was the opposite. I was in Damascus when I heard there's 400 points of protest going on Al Jazeera. 400 points of protest. You would think the whole country is erupting in protest. No matter what you called, tell them, do you see anything there? In any part of the cities, the big major cities, not a single, they probably gathered 100, 200, jumped and sang, and somewhere, of course, they filmed this in Al Jazeera. But did Al Jazeera report the hundreds of thousands of people going and pro-government, pro-reform? Never. So we've always seen something that was not the whole picture. Okay. I do want to talk about facts and fictions, if you allow me. 5 or 6 simple facts that were presented to us as fictions, and we believe every word of it till today. One, that the Syrian army killing its people, and the Syrian army is committing massacres. Let me just tell you this. The Syrian army is made from the people. It's mandatory to serve in the Syrian army. It's not selective, it's mandatory. So if the majority of the Syrians are Sunni Muslims, then the majority of the Syrian army is Sunni Muslims. So the Syrian army, since day one, and the Syrian army, by the way, is a nationalist army. We fought 2-3 wars against the state of Israel. It's an army that built on a very nationalist ideology, not on a sectarian ideology. It's not a militia. It's an army that includes every single one from every town, from every sect, from every religion. So that myth that the Syrian army was killing its people, well, it's the opposite. The proof to what the fiction versus the fact is that every little area gets taken by the so-called rebels, which we'll talk about in a little bit. The people that live in this area run away to where? To the government-controlled areas. When 20,000 mercenaries entered Aleppo, I believe in July 29th, 2012, entered the eastern part of Aleppo, where 1.5 million used to live, 1 million moved out. 1 million moved out to either western Aleppo, which is under the government control, or to the coast, which is the most protected area with the Syrian government. So if this is a genocide against the Syrian people, why are the people in every little town that is taken by these terrorist groups, they empty this town and they run to the areas controlled by the Syrian government? The wives and the children of these fighters, I've met some of them in my last trip to Damascus, live in government-controlled areas. So these fighters who are fighting these people, fighting the Syrian army, trust the Syrian government to protect their families. They don't trust each other because they are vicious. They go after each other. What happens in these areas, they destroy this area. Every little town they enter, they destroy. It's not the Syrian army who is destroying. The Syrian army, after the people cry out help, that they go in. We live in Damascus. Damascus would have been a very peaceful town if it wasn't for the bombardment of the rocket-propelled grenade, or the, what do you call the mortar bombs. Handmade mortar bombs. The rebels, so-called rebels, lives in a small area called Joba. For 4 years we've been suffering. We begged the Syrian government, the Syrian army, to level down this little neighborhood. They won't do it because there's a lot of civilians. We've suffered over hundreds, and the last just 3-4 years, hundreds of people lost their life. Indiscriminate shelling. Now, if this is not terrorism, I don't know what is terrorism. When you're driving down the street and a mortar bomb just fall on top of you, in schools, in buses, what are they trying to accomplish? How is that moderate? What is the moderate in that part of action? This has been happening for many, many years. Aleppo, the western part of Aleppo, been victimized for the last 4 years from these mortar bombs. And not just mortar bombs, from Grad missiles, because in Aleppo, they can get the heavy missiles that they cannot get into Damascus. Grad missiles, hell bombs. They've been falling, and the Syrian army has been quiet, have been patient. We have a lot of civilians. So when eventually the people feel we need to liberate this, we cannot live like this anymore. And the Syrian army trying to close in becomes a massacring its own people. No one is showing you the whole picture. So the second lie, the massacre committed by the Syrian army, you all seen the Hula massacre, and the Tiramisu massacre, and the Trains, and the Kafr Zaytun. All these massacres, I'm not going to spend time on it, all the evidence point to these killers. But at that time, you guys were not seeing what they're capable of, because ISIS were not publicizing their, viciousness at that time. So no one would believe that all these women and children were killed by anybody other than the Syrian army. Now that we've seen that they've been burning people alive, we've seen them crucifying people, we've seen them chopping heads left and right, show me a picture of one Syrian soldier shooting at a protester, at a peaceful protester. One. Since the beginning of this crisis, I ask anyone to provide me one picture of a Syrian soldier. But I have videos to show you when unarmed policemen were shut down early on in this crisis. In Homs, unarmed. There was a presidential decree back in April 2011 for all policemen not to carry weapons when they're protecting the civilians or protecting the peaceful protests. And one Friday in Homs, 21 policemen were shot down. Sniper. They were sniped. It was never told. We were never told these stories. The third fiction is that all Syrians, or majority of all Syrians, favor regime change in Syria. Well, wow. You go to Syria, you go to Damascus, you ask anyone. Hell no. The answer is always hell no. Even if you didn't like the regime, they will tell you, no, what we know is better than what we don't know. We can see what the alternatives are. No, we were living in peace. We're fine. We don't want. So the lie that keeps saying that all Syrian people want this, we want what the Syrian people want, right? That's not what they tell us, that they want what the Syrian people want. In all Western polls, as early as 2012, the fact is 70% of all Syrians are in support of Assad. In all polls. In January 17, 2012, The Guardian, in May 2013, when NATO admitted 70% of all Syrians support Assad, and 20%, by the way, they don't care. They want to end the war. They don't care who comes in power as long as they end. Only 10%, all the factions of all the different oppositions, of all 100 different names of different terrorist groups, they get only 10% of the support of the Syrians. So don't tell me this is not a proxy war for regime change in Syria, if the majority of Syrians are in support of their government. Early on in the crisis, we all stood, we wanted reform, don't get me wrong. We were happy Arab Springs, we all bought it. And even the President Assad, in one of the meetings that I had with him, he said, we enjoyed that change could come faster. The man took power, there was some old Ba'athist, yes, there is some slow in trying to make progress or reforms. Why? Because people don't like change. So it was happening for him a hard time trying to implement a lot of changes, but change was happening, and at slower pace. But maybe with this, Arab Spring, we can start reform fast. So the reform started faster, and the faster the reform would happen, the more they push us into destruction. There's nothing we could have done. I tell you what, nothing this government could have done to avoid what we are at today. This was meant to happen no matter what way, which direction you went. Syria was to be destroyed. A proxy war to change regime was happening way before 2011. And from me meeting with some of these factions and some of these ex-fighters, and knowing that they've been training since 2010, way before, and some of them before 2008, that tells you that we were up against way more. A couple more quick fictions versus facts. Civil war. The word civil war. They insist that there's a civil war in Syria. Okay, now in Damascus, it's the capital with the most mosaic meaning there is a different, all kinds of Syrians live in Damascus, meaning you have the Kurds, the Armenians, the Shia, the Alawite. I don't even know what to call them, because we never felt there's any difference between any two Syrians sitting next to each other. But they all exist in Damascus. So if there was a civil war in Syria, why aren't these people in Damascus going after each other? Why are they chopping each other's head, and why are they killing each other? Why aren't they like grouping and fighting? In Damascus, when I go to Damascus, I cannot feel safe if my neighbor, my Sunni Muslim neighbor, is not walking with me anywhere. If anything happens to me in Syria, do you think I'm going to worry about my church to protect me or the army? No. My neighbor will protect me. This Syrian, who does not see the difference between me and him. There is no civil war in Syria, my friends. This is a big myth. What's in Syria is a national war. A war of all Syrians against terrorist invasion. Terrorist invasion, unfortunately, some Syrians fell into it. Yes, collaborated. Yes, they sold out their country, but they are just minorities. They're not. Most Syrians do not see difference between one another because we believe we were there way before religions came about. All Syrians have been Syrians for 10,000 years before Christianity, before Judaism, before Islam came about. And all believe in secularism. Yes, the 10%, the Islamists want to see an ummah, they want to see Islamic Khilafah, but the 90% they don't. Now I have no idea why is the West trying to support those 10%, those moderate rebels versus the majority of the country, if it wasn't for regime change and for protect their interests or steal our resources in Syria. The last one is the moderate rebels. I mean, moderate rebels. I have asked a lot of people every time, and I'm talking about way early in, and we were like attacked heavily. I said, just show me one moderate rebel. It was Free Syrian Army. I said, Free Syrian Army, Abu Saqqar, who ate the dead Syrian soldier's heart. That's moderate to you? Or is it Ahrar al-Sham, who killed people? Or is it Nusra, who entered Sadr and killed people and threw them in the wells? Or burn them up alive? Or ISIS? No, it's not ISIS. Okay, is that Nusra? No, it's not Nusra. It's Ahrar al-Sham. It's not Ahrar al-Sham. He said the army of Islam. It's not the army of Islam. He said, so who is it? They cannot tell you who they favor, but they will tell you all the ones that they don't like. And because there isn't no moderate rebels. Anyone who carries weapons and kill is a terrorist. You live under a government, sovereign nation. I can just imagine any neighborhood here, for whatever reason, they decide to carry weapons and go out burning police stations, or attacking, or throwing bombs. The United States government, the army will come in there in 24 hours. And they will strip them down, and we have to make sure no weapons are taken out, and then what? And then they'll level down whoever is left inside. Why is it not okay for the Syrian government, after 5 years or 6 years of having all this filth arrive to Syria from the rest of the world? Why can't we defend our country? Why can't we defend our cities? Again, Turkey, tens of thousands of foreign jihadists enter Syria. That's a fact. That's not fiction. 82 different nationalities. Bashar al-Jafari, back in 2013, I think December 2012, provided at the United Nations pictures of either passports or identification cards of 82 different nationalities, either imprisoned or killed fighting the Syrian government. 82. Evidence. Nobody cared. Well, if you don't want to care, then stay the heck out, because we need to defend our country. This is our country. And if it wasn't... I don't want to take too much of your time, but if it wasn't for the media, and I go back and say the media, it wasn't Turkey or the United States. All these people, yes, they wanted the destruction of Syria. And they financed, and they facilitated. But it was the call for jihad on these media channels that caused all these jihadists to believe that there's a holy war in Syria. That call for jihad by Al Jazeera and over 200 other religious Islamist, Zionists, in my opinion, channels, okay? Calling for jihad, calling to come in Syria and kill the infidel. I'm the infidel, you're the infidel. Everyone who does not believe in their ideology is an infidel. Our war is the media. We got to win the media war before we can win the ground war. Okay, so we ask you, continue to speak out. We ask, if everyone knows the truth, then there will be enough pressure to stop, to prohibit people from inciting hate. This is inciting hate. Of destruction of countries by calling for the jihad. This should be shameful in the 21st century for such behavior to take place. I want to thank you for your time. I want to say, yes, I am happy Aleppo is liberated. I am not ashamed. I'm jubilant. Aleppo is liberated. Mark it in the history books. Syria has defeated its imperialist regime. This designed to have the conspiracy against Syria is over. Syria is liberated. Aleppo is liberated. Aleppo has not fallen. Aleppo has liberated. Thank you so much for your time. Allow me to introduce a very, very good friend. Like I said, we met in June of this year. I was in Damascus. I have known Eva, of course, of her writing, of her previous trips, but I never had a trip. I also want to thank Paul Larudi before I introduce Eva. Paul Larudi, we also known each other for a while, only on social media. Syrian Solidarity Movement, one of the very early voices. It's funny, we were on the 2014 and trip to Syria for the election after they banned us from voting here at the embassy. So we decided to make a trip to Syria. We went to Syria. And many times I spoke with Paul, and we never got a chance to meet. So here I am walking into a restaurant in Damascus on the eve of on the night of the election, and after a couple of hours, we chit-chatting with different tables, and someone sat on our table, and I asked him, "What are you guys doing?" He said, "We came forward to monitor the election. We're international monitors from all over part of the world." I said, "Where were you?" He said, "We were in Homs." I said, "Who's with you?" Is that anybody? He said, "Oh, of course, there's Paul Larudi." I said, "What? Paul Larudi is here? Please introduce me to him." So I went across over to this table, and I met him for the first time. It's the same way it happened. I met Eva totally by chance in Damascus on her the trip before last. And it's amazing to have such love and such persistence from someone who's not even Syrian. I mean, that's amazing to have that much help from someone who is unbiased, and that's the word. Unbiased reporting today is hard to come by, because all reporting today is very biased, and corporate media, we know how they work. So please help me welcome Eva Bartlette.
I couldn't have said it better. And then I'll follow up by saying, obviously I'm a paid agent of Syria and Russia. Some of you might have seen this video going around after having done a press conference at the UN, and it's gotten a few views. Yes. And because of that, I've gotten a few messages, and some articles have been written about me, hence the comment about being a paid agent. So right off the bat, I will say, one can visit Syria and observe and interact with Syrians and hear exactly what Johnny has said. And one can report that without being on the payroll of Russia or Syria. And that is my situation. And obviously, the way I'm dressed, if I was paid, it'd be a little bit better. And I will address just a couple of things. There's an article on Snope. It's basically around something I said, and I'm going to get into it in today's talk, about two instances of propaganda that have been used against the Syrian government and Russians. One is about the Quds hospital, and one is about children who've been seen in different instances and have been used to pull on heartstrings of people to thus do something, which usually involves safe zone, no flying zone in Syria, so they can impose regime change, which has always been the plan. But before I get into all that stuff, I just want to say, Johnny touched on many things that I always try to talk about, so now I don't have to, but I will corroborate what he said. For example, let's see. Yeah, so for example, the whole issue of unarmed protesters. I've been to Syria 6 times now since 2014, and have traveled largely on my own or with a translator, but often on my own. I've spent months in the country and traveled around to Homs many times, to Aleppo 4 times, Latakia, Tartus, Nasiaf, Jebel, Sueda, Maouda, I think that's it. I haven't been to the areas where al-Nusra and their allies, whatever color, whatever faction, whatever badge they're wearing, I haven't been to those areas for 2 reasons, 2 main reasons. One, I don't feel the need to validate them. They are mercenaries, and they are terrorists. And if you go to Syria and you experience just a fraction of what Syrians have been enduring for nearly 6 years now, you also will call them terrorists because they're all committing the same heinous terrorist acts. The media has dressed up FSA and Ahrar al-Sham, notably Zinki, as moderates, but they have committed beheadings, and they have committed, for example, the beheading of a 12-year-old or 13-year-old Palestinian boy, Abdullah Isa. The so-called moderates that are doing the Zinki can be seen online methodically sawing his head off. These are the moderates the West wants to bring democracy and human rights to in Syria. But on the note of protesters, on my summer visit to Syria, I met a young man who at the time was 24 years old. He was a soldier. He had been based in Damascus, but he was sent with about 300 other soldiers down to Dara to keep the peace. This was he was sent in March 2011, and they were specifically told they could not bring weapons, so they only had batons. Now, this is just his testimony, but I'm inclined to believe it because it is corroborated by other articles and other investigations. And basically, the way he said it was the first 3 Fridays, they had no weapons, they were gunned down. Not that every single protester had a weapon, but amongst the protesters, there were people that had weapons, and they were shooting on both police and soldiers. The first Friday, 29 were gunned down. The second Friday, 52 were gunned down. And I don't remember how many were killed the third Friday. But the point being, the government did not allow them to have weapons because it was trying to defuse the situation. And yet, Al Jazeera and all these other corrupt, Gulf or imperialist media were saying a different story. And in fact, he said, Eva, I saw footage from those first protests being shown later on Al Jazeera, and they were saying this is now May or June. They were using footage from the March protests in which there was chaos and firing. They weren't showing who was firing, and they were saying this just continued, this is June. As Johnny said, all over Syria these types of things were happening, and I would refer to my first visit when Paul, Larudi, and other colleagues of the Syria Solidarity Movement, we were there and we went to various places, including Latakia. And in Latakia, we met a woman who's been living there for 20 years, and she said, maybe it was mid-2011 at this point, she's referring to a day in which the LA Times had said, chaos, security forces, soldiers, army, shooting on people, killing people, massacres. She said, I bet I had been out doing errands and been to every place the LA Times listed in that report, and there was none of that happening. And I've heard this again and again and again from Syrians. So again, it's their testimony, but I'm inclined to believe them before I would believe a Gulf-funded media or an imperialist agenda media. On the note of areas where the government has allowed women and children of fighters to live, there's one specific example I can give, and it's called Gazi. And I think it came under a truce deal in, I want to say, early 2014. So you will find actually fighters, I can't say, I think they're either FSA, they must be FSA, at the gate to this community having weapons. And so the deal is they can have weapons to ensure security within the community, but they're not supposed to fight against the army. This, I would say, on the part of the government, is a massive amount of trust, and maybe allowing these people to remain there. The women inside, maybe their husbands or loved ones are still in Jobar and firing these dirty mortars onto Damascus and fighting against the Syrian army and people. One time when I was going through Gaza, returning from Homs or Maouda or somewhere, one of these, I was taking photos, I'd asked if I could, and after I took a couple of photos, a sniper fired at our car. So that's to say, the army, the Syrian government is enabling these people to be there and hoping that they're going to keep the peace on good faith, but they do break it. And yet the Syrian government continues to allow them to be there because they've always been trying to reach some sort of political solution, but you'll never hear about this in our media. The other thing I want to touch on is the issue of sectarianism. As Johnny was saying, about walking with this Sunni friend, Everywhere I went in Syria, people told me, first, I'm Syrian. They insisted that they wouldn't even talk about their faith, and it was considered rude to press them on it. But when I did, I would find out the same thing. People intermingled, intermarried, sharing one another's religious holidays. This sectarianism is sent from outside, and it's not part of the Syrian fabric. And it's a way of confusing people outside, of making people think, just like they've done with Palestine. We know with Palestine they say, oh, the Jews and the Muslims couldn't get along for centuries, for millennia. We know that's not the case in Palestine. It's not about Jews and Arabs. It's about the Zionist political agenda, genociding Palestinians. And with Syria, it's not about Muslims. It's not about Sunnis versus Alawis. It's a foreign war on Syria, and all faiths are fighting against it. So that's just to corroborate a lot of what Johnny said. I could say more, but I think you probably want to hear some things about my trips to Aleppo. As Johnny mentioned, it is dangerous to go there for various reasons. The highway leading to Aleppo, called the Qanasr Highway, and even the highway leading from Homs to Qanasr. So Homs is rather central Syria. The Qanasr Highway is the alternative highway going to Aleppo because the main highway passes through territory occupied by terrorists or militants. So for years, the only highway people have been able to use is this much smaller one, a long detour. And on either side, it's flanked by ISIS or al-Nusra, sometimes just 5 miles away. And ISIS does actually creep onto the highway at night and lay landmines. So it's dangerous for those reasons. It's dangerous because when you get near Aleppo, there's an area called Ramuse. Now, this is all in the past tense because now these areas are liberated. But at that time, Ramuse, just beyond Ramuse, there's a district called Sheikh Said, and it was occupied by terrorists who would snipe on people on Ramuse, the road, or that would even shell that area. So it was very dangerous. I know a doctor, Dr. Nabil Al-Antaki, whose brother was murdered a few years ago. He was basically taken off the bus by these terrorists and just shot dead. And the other ways it was dangerous was simply by being in Aleppo. Because, I'm sure this audience doesn't need to be told, but when our media refers to Aleppo, they didn't mean Greater Aleppo. They meant the areas occupied by rebels. So they meant these pockets that terrorists had occupied since mid-2012 or so, and from where they had been firing, as Johnny was mentioning, mortars, grad missiles, gas canister bombs, water heater bombs, explosive bullets, and they'd also been sniping at people. And I've met victims, including children, of these snipers. And I've also met people who've been badly maimed, and I've seen people who've been killed by these mortars and gas canister bombs. Most of you are probably aware of cooking gas in Syria. That's the main way that people cook. So there's varying sizes, but the standard size is maybe this high off the ground. And these basically have been rendered into bombs by adding a tail, stuffing them full of explosives, and stuffing them full of shrapnel or bits of metal to ensure more damage. This is also actually something the US, I'm sure, does with their dirty bombs, and it's something the Zionists do, because I lived in Gaza for 3 years, and I saw the effects of a dart bomb. And it's the same idea. You stuff it full of darts or shrapnel, and it inflicts more damage on people. These moderate rebel terrorists have been doing this, have been firing these on the Syrians for years, and our media isn't speaking about it. And they continue to, from areas outside of Aleppo or the remaining areas within Aleppo, that there is still a small amount of terrorists occupying. And for years, in the last 5 years, according to the head of forensics, Dr. Zahir Hajo, 11,000 civilians have been killed by these bombs or snipings. That's 11,000 men, women, and children. And we don't hear about that. And we also don't hear about the hospitals that have been hit by these terrorist bombings. One of the major ones is the Al-Qaeda Hospital. It was the largest and the best cancer research hospital in the Middle East. It was destroyed in late 2013 by al-Nusra truck bombings. The director of Al-Qaeda is a man named Dr. Ibrahim Hadid, who I met in my last visit to Aleppo. Dr. Ibrahim told me he'd been the director for 12 years. When the hospital was occupied in 2012 by terrorists, he talked to whatever international agencies who would, you would expect would be outraged, as Ban Ki-moon is always outraged when these alleged strikes in hospitals occurred. Nobody gave a damn, and nobody really did anything to liberate these hospitals from the clutches of moderate terrorist rebels. And in 2013, when it was exploded and destroyed by these truck bombs, he said there was no reaction, silence. Now you fast forward to 2016, and this year there's been nonstop chatter, propaganda, largely, about hospitals hit. Now, there may have been some hospitals hit, but it also has to be recognized that in areas of eastern Aleppo, terrorists weaponized schools and hospitals. So there is a reason in certain instances, if hospitals have been hit, there's a reason, and we can get into that soon, including evidence to this fact. Another hospital that's never talked about was the maternity hospital. This was in Greater Aleppo, and I visited it. It was destroyed internally, and I'm not going to be, what's the word I'm looking for? I'm not going to exaggerate like the corporate media is. It wasn't leveled, it wasn't reduced to rubble like MSF said at the Quds Hospital. It was internally gutted because the terrorists fired a rocket which landed in a parked car outside, which exploded, exploding 2 or so neighboring parked cars. And you can see this footage on Ruptly, I've seen it. And it gutted the inside of the hospital and destroyed the equipment and killed 3 women. And there was almost no mention no mention in the media that I'm aware of, even though this was a hospital target and this is apparently a war crime, except when the terrorists do it. So I just want to talk a little bit about what life has been like for the people of Aleppo over these past few years until recently. Because the terrorists did occupy areas where the water pumping stations were and where the power plant is, for years people in Aleppo have suffered for want of water and for want of electricity. Now, I also know, just harkening back to my days in Gaza, I lived in central Gaza, and because the Israelis destroyed the only water power plant, for years Gaza has been hobbling around on insufficient and inadequate electricity. The lack of electricity affects everything. It affects healthcare, it affects the ability to pump water if there is running water, it affects every aspect of life. People in Aleppo, if they could afford it, were buying electricity from generators, but many people couldn't. So there's a segment of the population that have for years been living without electricity. These would be the people most likely that are living on the front lines, also being sniped at by terrorists. And if you go to these front lines, as I did, you will see large screens set up. It won't definitively protect them. They can still shoot through the screens. They're just metal pieces of metal. But the idea is they block the view, so probably they won't be shot at because the terrorists aren't going to waste all their ammo every single day. Also, the lack of electricity, as I said, affects water. The water situation was such that finally government officials and independent associations dug something like over 300 wells just to compensate for the lack of running water. And not all these wells were drinkable water, so you had then cases of people drinking contaminated water and getting ill from it. And I think we might all remember this past, I think it was last summer, or maybe a year ago, there was a very critical situation where if you were following Syria, you were seeing people trying to get water from any source. And if you were following, independent or Syrian media, there were many cases of people getting ill and even, I'll just leave it at getting ill from drinking contaminated water. This is all preventable. But this is a way that the terrorists were punishing people in Greater Aleppo because they rejected this phony revolution and they stood with their government. When I was in Aleppo in November, I went twice in November for my 3rd and 4th time. The 3rd time I joined, and I want to make this point very clearly, I joined a group of foreign Western journalists, including from BBC, New York Times, LA Times, and some other media I wasn't really aware of. The leg of the journey from Damascus to Aleppo was covered by the Syrian government. We went in a bus with military escort. So we did not pay for that, but we did pay for the hotels. And otherwise, every time I've gone to Syria, I've paid my own expenses, whether with my money, borrowed money, or fundraised money. I'm just making that point again for the Snopesters out there. But when we were there for 3 days. So on the first day, we all together went and visited these areas, predominantly Christian areas in the old city that had been ravaged by terrorism, churches that had been leveled, areas where the residents had left because the terrorism was so bad. And even in some areas, we were told, don't speak loudly, do not use lights because the snipers will shoot on you if you do. We also went to liberated areas of Beni Zaid and Meyramoun, their industrial districts. I'd been there in August, but anyway, it was interesting to go there this time for a few reasons. We were there with an Aleppo MP, Faris Shahabi, and he was giving us information on the destruction of Aleppo's industries. And this is a very significant factor because it's not only tragic loss of human life in Syria, it's not only the physical destruction, but it's the attack on Syria's economy. So thanks to Turkey, thanks to Erdogan, thanks to letting terrorists into Syria, thanks to Erdogan allowing these terrorists to steal the factories, to steal the machinery, the heavy transformers, massive machinery, and truck them into Turkey. This has really devastated Aleppo's economy and Syria's economy in general. So Farid Shahabi outlined that and told us about, he took us to the old city. We went through areas of the old city, which again were dangerous because in certain areas there were snipers, we had to be careful. But he also outlined how terrorists have systematically destroyed historic buildings in the old city. At least 20 historic buildings have been tunnel bombed. Again, these are the actions of moderates that our media crazily, preposterously says are fighting for freedom in Syria. And they're destroying Syria's history. And they've done it in Palmyra, they've done it in Maghula, they've done it elsewhere. Another point that that MP Farid Shahabi made was that he launched a lawsuit against Erdogan. And he said maybe 2 weeks after he'd been on television talking about this lawsuit, the Chamber Industry building, which itself was an historic building, was tunnel bombed and destroyed. There were other things that he had to talk about, but interestingly, when we were in Later Moon, 2 more points I want to make there, 3 more points. Later Moon and Beni Zaid were occupied by terrorists, including of the so-called Free Syrian Army, these moderates, the 16th Brigades. They had an underground prison, 3 levels down. They had a few rooms that were in this normal building that they made into prison rooms. They'd also crafted solitary confinement cells, 9 of them I counted. Underground, the rooms were perfectly intact. Above ground, the buildings were badly damaged by airstrikes. Using one's critical thinking, one would realize the reason the buildings above ground are so heavily damaged is because terrorists within are underground. And even if you're airstriking the buildings above ground and creating this physical destruction in an area where most of the civilians had long fled and the army is fighting against terrorists, the terrorists are below ground, so it's very difficult to actually reach them. So this is just, I'm not a military expert, but that occurred to me as we were down below ground. Well, it's pretty intact. And yet when you go up above ground, you hear the journalists that were on that television saying, oh, the destruction, oh, the destruction. No context. They didn't even talk about the fact that terrorists had occupied these areas. There was also evidence of Turkey's involvement in that. We found a Turkish cell phone card. So, there's a lot of evidence about Turkey's involvement in Syria. Not only has Erdogan enabled terrorists to flood in and out of Syria and the theft of industries, but Erdogan Turkey has many times attacked Syria. And, this is not, again, the act of a revolution. This is the act of a country warring upon its sovereign nation. Other things that I saw when I was in Syria, so if we're talking about propaganda, there have been many campaigns that have been used to vilify the Syrians and then the Russians when they entered into the Syrian war against terrorism, which was in late September 2015, at the invitation of the Syrian government, which is contrary to the US-led coalition who are illegally in Syria's airspace. Since the Russian entry, and even before Russian warplanes entered into Syria airspace, there were headlines screaming of civilians being killed by the Russians. And since that time, there have been many campaigns used, since the beginning, against the Syrian government and then against both. Campaigns about starvation. So a military tactic, if you have a populated area, an area populated with terrorists, is to deny the terrorists access to weapons and also to food. Because if they don't have food, eventually they're going to say, khalas, and they're going to say, give us a solution. We'll reconcile or ship us to Idlib. And this happened with Homs, and it might happen with Aleppo. But instead of saying, the military didn't just obliterate a neighborhood and kill the terrorists, this is actually a more humane way of dealing with the terrorists, the media doesn't say that. And I'm going to give some examples. There's an area called Madaya outside of Damascus. In January this year, everybody was talking about Madaya. 40,000, we don't know that number, it might have been inflated, it seems like it was inflated. 40,000 starving civilians in Madaya. Every single newspaper of note overnight was talking about this. Overnight, literally, it wasn't just one after the other, it was just suddenly, one day, everybody was talking about it. This was one example of many of orchestrated media campaigns. And there are some notable facts about the lead up to this overnight sudden concern for Madaya. One fact that's very important is that the Red Cross spokesman himself in October 2015 had said, with the assistance of the Syrian government, The Red Cross, the UN, and various aid agencies had sent in enough food and aid into Madaya to last for many months. Yet, from mid-October, or whenever that was, to January, a period of 3 months or less, October, November, by January everybody was starving, or mass starvation. So why? And why is the Syrian government the only one being blamed? Because this fits the narrative. You have to vilify the Syrian government if you want to then get your no-fly zone, or your regime change, your humanitarian intervention. When journalists actually went in and talked with residents, and when I say journalists, I don't mean corporate media, because Murad Gaziev, who works with Achi, went in and he specifically said there's no Western journalists, although they could have gone, but there was no Western journalists there. He interviewed people, and they were saying what you will hear from Aleppo if you're paying attention to journalists on the ground in Aleppo. He was saying the people are saying the terrorists are starving us, they're stealing our food, they're selling it at 3, 4, 5 times the price, we can't afford it, we want the terrorists out of here. Similar things were heard with the district named Yarmouk, which is in Damascus. And as we were talking about the Palestinian issue, the area of Yarmouk has been used to politicize people who are supportive of Palestinian sovereignty and the Palestinian struggle, and confused about Syria, because the issue of Yarmouk was made to be the Syrian government was attacking the Palestinians in Yarmouk. No mention was made of the fact that the terrorists were occupying large areas of Yarmouk, which was not exclusively a Palestinian district. It had about 170,000 to 200,000, estimates vary, Palestinians, and over 1 million Syrians. And with the aid of the Syrian government, both Palestinians and Syrians were enabled to go to shelters outside of the district, because there was fighting there. And there are many instances documented when the Syrian government, when the Red Crescent, and when journalists come under fire entering Yarmouk. Sorry, not the Syrian government, when aid, I meant to say, and Red Crescent and journalists entering Yarmouk come under fire. Yet all the media said the Syrian government is starving the Palestinians in Yarmouk. Same story. Fast forward to Aleppo. This is all we've heard. In fact, what we've heard from the UN itself, and the UN is the authority, is that 250,000, somebody said 270,000, 300,000, but let's go with the UN's 250,000. For the last few years, they've been saying 250,000 starving civilians in Aleppo. The government is besieging 250,000 civilians in Aleppo. No mention of the terrorists. Well, okay, Aleppo was liberated, except for this very small pocket, which might be less than 1%. So, according to the Jibrin Center, which has documented has registered refugees who've come displaced people who've come from eastern Aleppo, somewhere between 90,000 to 100,000 people have been registered. And if we add, be generous and add 20,000 people maybe who didn't register, they went to their families, or whatever. Let's say 120,000 people have come out of eastern Aleppo. Where are the other 130,000? We've been hearing about it. The government's starving 130,000. Where are they? The UN, this is typical. The UN, the media, they make these lies, they make these statements, and then they don't ever have to actually come back and retract and say, we were wrong. We didn't have sources on the ground. We were pulling this out of the air. And they'll never admit it, but this is what they've been doing since the beginning. When they said about the unarmed protesters, when they said these vilification campaigns about starvation, last hospitals. Let's talk about last hospitals. Has anybody heard about the last hospital in Aleppo? Yeah, how many times? For how many months? I mentioned the Quds Hospital in April, and I'm going to be very careful with my words because I don't want it to be misconstrued. In April of this year, in another orchestrated media campaign, everybody was talking about the Quds Hospital. And the source for this information was an MSF, Medicine Sans Frontières, or Doctors Without Borders statement, in which, and they actually have contradicting statements, we'll take one of them. One of their statements says airstrikes, they can't determine if it was Syrian or Russian, destroyed the Quds Hospital. And they allege it was targeted. So targeted implies that coordinates are known. And later, in other statements, they say, well, it was an unidentified, unmarked hospital. So how can it be targeted? Other statements and news articles contradict one another. Some say airstrikes, some say helicopter strikes. Some say, in fact, the Medicine Sans Frontières report itself says, I was just reading it today for this Snopes article, says that first forget what time, there was a strike on the school across from the hospital. And rescuers, probably white helmets, went out to rescue people and bring them to the hospital. Then there was a strike on the residences down the street. Are residences a hospital? No, but in the MSF report itself, they said on the residences down the street. They did not say the hospital. So there are contradictory reports. But the effect was for everybody to say the Syrian government or the Russians are striking hospitals, they are evil, we must do something. And now, fast forward some months, and I'm again going to make reference to this Snopes article because in September, The Guardian reported that a hospital in Al-Sukari district, which is the Quds hospital in southeast Aleppo, was treating victims of chemical weapons from the Syrian government. So one of the other Medicine Sans Frontier reports said the hospital was destroyed. You can find tweets of it saying it was destroyed. It wasn't damaged, it was destroyed. Does that not imply completely non-functional? So in September, it's suddenly functioning, treating victims of chemical weapons. Another point about the chemical weapons, at some point, 2013 or so, terrorists occupied the only chemical weapon, the only chlorine factory in Syria. This is a fact that even corporate media have reported, but then they forget when they make their allegations. I actually, in University Hospital in November, I saw some victims of what appeared to be some sort of chemical gas attack. And they were being treated with oxygen, and they were seemingly suffocating. And these were people that genuinely, according to doctors in the Al-Razi Hospital, were suffering chemical attacks. And we asked them, has this happened before? They said, yes, we believe that mustard and chlorine have been used on our people in Aleppo. So there have been actual chemical attacks perpetrated, and even Carla Del Ponte admitted that the Khan al-Assad attack, which I think was 2012, maybe 2013, was done by the rebels with sarin. And then Seymour Hersh's article traced the routing of sarin from Libya or something through Turkey to the rebels. So there have been so many allegations against the government, and time and again, it's been the rebels or the terrorists. This is not to say innocent people don't die, it's a war. The country is fighting a war against terrorists, and there will be innocent people who die on both sides. But overwhelmingly, the situation has been, as Johnny was saying, the Syrian people is of the people. And everywhere I've gone, I've seen the people respect the Syrian army to the extent that there's a gentleman in the audience here. One of his friends is a friend of mine named Hala in Damascus, and she's one of the group of volunteers who cook food. They spend all day cooking food, and then they go to the front lines in Jober or other areas of the Damascus countryside. They risk their lives taking the food to the Syrian army. And would you do that if you're really being oppressed and hate the army? Obviously not. There's so many indications if you're actually in Syria and talking with the people, they support their army. Maybe there's a minority who support this warped notion of a revolution or Muslim Brotherhood or money or drugs, but the majority of the people support the army. I just want to say a few more things. The US-led coalition, which is illegal in Syria, purports to be fighting terrorism, when we know the only ones fighting terrorism in Syria are the Syrians, the Russians, and the allies, Hezbollah, etc., in the region. In fact, the degree to which the US-led coalition is not fighting terrorism goes to September 17th attack on a Syrian army position in Deir ez-Zor, in which they killed at least 83 Syrian soldiers in an attack that lasted almost 1 hour, and it wasn't just a one-off, it was repeated attacks on this position, including attacking retreating soldiers, and including, despite the fact that the Russians were calling the Americans in this coalition saying stop firing on Syrian soldiers. And until this day, the American government has not actually said, I'm sorry, we committed this attack, this premeditated attack. Instead, at first they said we didn't do it, and I think later they said whoops or something. And a few days later, then Samantha Power was saying barbaric, referring to Syria and Russia, over some false flag attack in West Aleppo. When clearly, it's like, I can't remember if it was Johnny said, or somebody said today, minutes after something occurs, they already know who did it. They have the whole story without an investigation. So a few days after the murder of these soldiers in Deir ez-Zor, there was an attack on an aid convoy. The situation was murky, and immediately everybody knew it was the Syrians or the Russians, clearly. If the Russians did it, it was still Syrians' fault. When we actually had time to look at the facts, it was clear that it was in an area controlled by either Nuruddin Zinki or Ahrar al-Sham or Nusra, I forget which, but controlled by terrorists. And the evidence that was presented was laughable. One of the photos they presented, saying it was struck by an airstrike, showed an intact room with a very small dent in the ground, cardboard boxes scattered around, the tail end of a large Russian bomb. And I later saw, if you look at a site called A Closer Look on Syria, it linked to a YouTube video showing what the impact of that bomb would actually look like. And it showed a man standing in a crater, up to his thighs. So this tail end of the bomb in a room that was intact, surrounded by boxes slightly destroyed, was supposed to be the evidence to show that the Russians had attacked this aid convoy. And so this man of power was saying, barbaric, 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 when they just slaughtered Syrian soldiers. And this attack on Syria's sovereignty is not the first time the U.S. has done it. They've done it many times. They've destroyed the infrastructure in Israel. In the name of fighting ISIS, they've actually attacked villages and killed Syrian civilians. This whole war on Syria, I don't think I need to tell you, it's not about human rights and democracy. And if you're watching the news now, and for example, earlier this afternoon, I was at home where CNN was playing, and two Western commentators were emoting about the genocide and humanitarian catastrophe. And they had no, I'm going to start cursing, clue what was really happening on the ground. They were just reading from the telescript. If they had the courage, moral integrity to go to Syria, or even just to talk to Syrians in Syria, in Aleppo, they would find out that the people are overjoyed that they've been liberated. And they would find out that the Syrian army risked their life to do so. And on many occasions, the Syrian army were acting as human shields when terrorists fired upon them. When I was in Aleppo with this delegation in early November, we went to two humanitarian crossings, the Bustan and Casa crossing, and the Castello Road crossing. Bustan and Casa crossing, nobody left that day. We were there for about an hour. Castello Road, we were there for maybe 2 hours, and at the end of our time there, it was shelled twice by terrorists, clearly by terrorists. It came from a terrorist-occupied area. The second shell was close enough that the security was so worried about us, they ushered us off. It was less than 100 meters away. And it was shelled 5 more times that day. Because the terrorists within, even though the Syrians and Russians had opened up 8 humanitarian corridors to enable civilians and militants to leave, the terrorists within did not want that. They were keeping the population hostage. Don't take my word for that. Take the words of people who've now left Eastern Aleppo and are saying they were keeping us hostage. They were stealing our food. They weren't allowing us to leave. When I was there a week later in Aleppo, I met 2 different families that had escaped in late October. I interviewed them on November 10th, and they told the same story. One family was from a district called Al-Halak, near Bustan Pasha, just north. And they said, we tried to leave twice before, and they violently prevented us from leaving. They also said the same things about food being stolen and hoarded. The other family were from Tariq al-Bab, also kind of northeastern Aleppo, and they had tried to flee 4 times before and been violently prevented. So these stories abound, but you aren't going to hear it on our corporate media. If I could play a short clip from Aleppo, it would just take a minute just to hook up the computer. I'd like to share with you a voice of a woman, a very articulate woman. I had been on a local TV program, and she stopped me as I was walking through Aleppo University campus. And actually, I'll just tell you why I was there at that campus. I was there because I heard that at Aleppo University, of 20 residences, 16 were housing displaced people from eastern areas of Aleppo, or areas of Aleppo that had been occupied by terrorists. And over the years in Aleppo, there was something like, I believe it was something like 500,000 or 600,000 people had left areas occupied by terrorists and taken shelter in government-secured Aleppo. And I met some of these people in other areas like Latakia, driven out by terrorists, starting their lives anew in different areas, living in very harsh conditions because there's a mass of people. There's like 7 or 8 million internal refugees in Syria. And they all go to government-secured areas, whether Aleppo, Latakia, Tartus, Jebel, Homs, Damascus, Saida. And these are people, Sunnis from Daraa, Sunnis from Hasaka, Sunnis from Deir ez-Zor. And I'm only making the Sunni point because we're told it's a war against Sunnis, and that's complete crap. Aleppo was predominantly Sunni, and people rejected this so-called revolution. Anyway, so this woman, when I was there at the university residences, which housed maybe 15,000 IDPs, and which the week prior had been attacked with a rocket attack by these terrorists, killing at least 4 people in my family. This woman stopped me to chat, and she was so heartfelt when she was talking and said, "Can I please record you?" So if I can just pause for a moment to hook up the computer, I'll show you what she had to say. Is it possible to dim the lights just
Yeah,
for this?
dim the light.
Yeah. Is it the universe?
Well, that's it.
Is it the universe?
Yes, they aimed it right to my camera. They aimed it right to the camera.
Very system.
Full screen? Just don't make it full screen. Oh, no, it's okay.
Move it a little bit to the right, just a little bit.
Okay. What you were saying, your situation in Aleppo.
Here in Aleppo we face this every day. Here in Aleppo we face bombs every day. But we have very power to live here, and we have how can I express for you the feeling? We can't leave our city here. We can't leave our city for these people which they want to take our lands, which they come from out of our country. They want to kill us. They want to take our country. We can't leave this. Really, I can't hold any arms to fight with army or something else. But I can fight when I stay in my home, when I stay in my city, when I try to change anything bad. But as you see, the situation is very bad.
You can't take arms, but do you support the army?
I support the army because he defends for our country.
Now we're in the university area where there's residences for displaced people. Are you living here?
No.
No?
I'm living in a place which you can call it in the face of this which Al-Nusra. My home in the face of the building of them.
What area?
Specifically.
Alhamdulillah Salami.
Every day, some children they killed by snapper. Every day, a lot of people killed by bombs. Every day by Jarrah gas. Every day, but we're still there and we're still living there, and we want to live there. We don't want to leave our country because these people are not Syrian. These people they have the money to kill us and to take our money and to take our city, but we are not going to give them to take this. Anyway, we support our Syrian army because really they do the best to keep our country
Do you have any relatives in areas of East Aleppo occupied by terrorists? Thank you.
Okay, so that is the spirit I met where I went in Syria. That steadfastness, that defiance and unwillingness to be driven out. Yes, people have left. There are refugees outside of Syria. There are people who left due to the fighting. Maybe they're also against the state. And there are people, hundreds of thousands, who left due to the economic situation, the devastation of the economy, due to 6 years of war against the country, and also the criminal Western sanctions. But there are so many people who stayed and are fighting for their country in whatever way. Like she said, fighting by staying, fighting by not being driven out by these terrorists, or supporting the army, whether they're in the army, a local defender, or bringing food to the army. I'll wrap it up. I just want to make a couple of points. In terms of our media sources, corporate media will tell you some truths because, I'm not an expert on how it works, but it's clear that there have been orchestrated campaigns to misguide people, and it's clear that corporate media has obfuscated many, endlessly on Syria. But also, when you hear reports, and especially now, when you hear reports, listen carefully to who they're citing or sourcing. Are they citing the SOHR, the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, who is one person who hasn't been in Syria for something like 15 years, who is determinedly anti-government, and who has an agenda which supports regime change, and who himself relies on activists or unnamed sources? That's one. Are they citing the activists or unnamed sources themselves? And I've seen a few recent articles, very interesting, naming some of these characters who were routinely cited. And they're portrayed as, activists, but many of them have affiliations to Jabhat al-Nusra, Ahmad al-Sham, Free Syrian Army. Are they quoting groups like the MSF, which, yes, they support hospitals in Syria, but only in al-Nusra areas? And they themselves rely on unnamed activists. Are they quoting the United Nations, which on a December 13th, in one of their most recent lies, in a December 13th report, they accuse the Syrian government of killing something like 82 people. Yet they don't provide a single source, no credible evidence. So we're supposed to believe this group that has routinely lied, that said there was 250,000 starving people in eastern Aleppo, and it was wrong, and has been wrong in many things, and has chosen to ignore things like Israel supporting terrorists, patching them up in their hospitals, and funneling them back into Syria to fight. We're supposed to believe this is credible when they say the Syrian army, which is just, they don't say which is just, this is in parentheses, which is just liberated Aleppo, is wantonly slaughtering people in the remaining areas, and not providing a single source. And this is the source of all corporate media reporting now on this massacre of people in Aleppo this week. There's one other source, there's a few other I want to mention. The AMC, the so-called Aleppo Media Center, is funded by the West. The white helmets, the so-called Syrian civil defense, are funded by the West, and not lightly. They're funded by at least $100 million. What do they need $100 million to do with if they're just local grassroots rescuers rescuing something like 60,000 people over the years? This is what they claim. The right livelihood description is that Syrian civil defense saved over 60,000 people in Aleppo and in Idlib and in Al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda areas in which they solely operate. So why then, when I went to Aleppo 4 times and talked to people who have loved ones in East Aleppo, who they communicate with and who they're worried about, why did nobody know about the white helmets? If they're communicating with their friends and loved ones in eastern Aleppo who are being saved by these noble, brilliant rescuers, why aren't they telling their loved ones in greater Aleppo? Why is why have the majority of people who came out of eastern Aleppo and who have spoken to colleagues like Vanessa Beeley, Andrew Ashdown, Jan Oberg, who were on the ground this week in eastern Aleppo, who visited this Jabreen Center, who visited other areas that were occupied by terrorists, and who spoke with and took the testimonies of people? Why did nobody hear of the white helmets? It's because they are a propaganda group, and they were up for the Nobel Peace Prize to validate them, to make us think that they're credible, that they are liars. And they have the slickest propaganda, although it's not that slick. If you actually watch it carefully, sometimes it's just the most absurd propaganda you could see. But this has been so effective, this propaganda. People who are working, who don't have time to really think, and they just turn on CNN, Fox, BBC, Democracy Now!, and they get their soundbite news and they're told civil war, revolution in 2016. They're told all these lies that we shouldn't be believing by now. People, they'll get these soundbites about the white helmets and they'll think, just a few days ago, my dear friend, Nancy sent me a message and said, Eva, I'm so sorry, you must be heartbroken about Aleppo. And she wasn't being sarcastic, she was being genuine. And I said, no, I'm ecstatic. Aleppo's been liberated, why would I be heartbroken? And I realized that she was seeing the news that, she was believing the news. She's not a stupid person, she's a woman that has a family that turned on the news and was told that there's a genocide in Aleppo. The media is not reporting the truth on the ground. I want to end just with a few quotes. One from John Oberg, who I think is Swedish, who was in Aleppo. And a few days ago he wrote on Facebook that he was at this Jabreen reception center for displaced people from Eastern Aleppo. He said, all I talked with today expressed their joy and their freedom for the end of the 4-year siege and for the assistance from the Syrian government and army. And he said they were told 90,000 to 100,000 had left Eastern Aleppo. This is after almost all the areas except for a small pocket have been liberated. And then my friend and colleague Vanessa Bealey, whose research into the white helmets, I really recommend you read 21st Century Wire, or if you want, just watch a short 5-minute film, White Helmets, Al-Qaeda with a Facelift. Very good film. Vanessa had to say, she said she spoke with a woman who, gosh, I can't even remember my handwriting. She said she spoke with residents who spoke about starving and malnutrition. And she was talking about one older lady who apparently got down on her knees and begged one of the militant factions for food, and they shot her in the face. And Vanessa, I think I'd like to end with her words because she's on the ground and, our media is lambasting her, calling her a conspiracy theorist or a paid agent of Syria, like they're doing with me and like they do with Johnny and like they do with anybody who speaks the truth about Syria. She said your media and propaganda have supported the incarceration, torture, and abuse and horrors that these civilians have been living for years. So I guess in conclusion, please do what you can to educate people and to contest this lying media. And if you see people like Vanessa being slandered in the corporate media, or Johnny when he speaks out, come to their support. Don't let them be defeated. They won't be, because people like Vanessa and Johnny know what the truth is, and we're going to walk with the truth, no matter what. But please do support people who are telling the truth, because it's not just about them and their egos or their, wounded, whatever. It's about the lies which lead to more deaths in Syria. Thank you.